have some idea that India was a glorious civilization, but that was long time ago. At the time of Buddha, Shankaracharya, Aryabhatta, maybe Bhaskaracharya in 10th century. So that glory is long gone and past, and the story of India was one of some decayed, stagnant society with a rich past, of course. So that sort of image was turned down. Much of that image was created during 19th, 20th century only. The people in 18th century didn't think that they were backward or stagnant in any sense, as you will see. But that image has been countered, and one of the persons who had contributed a great deal to that is Sri Dharampalji. So Sri Dharampalji's life has been concerned with this fact that conquest usually subordinates the soul of a people when it does not lead to total physical annihilation of the conquered, as it did happen with the case of people in the continents of America and Australia. The indigenous people were largely, they disappeared from the scene. So still, even when the people are alive, it still extinguishes all their self-respect, sense of human dignity. A conquered people tend to lose consciousness of the fact that they had their own civilizational aims, ambitions. They had their own sciences, technologies, arts, literature, philosophies, ways of thought, as well as also social, political, economic ideas and institutions through which they organize their lives in accordance with their preferences and seekings. I am reading this because these are carefully chosen words. I will not be able to offhand tell you like that. So the life of Sri Dharampal was modeled by an acute awareness of this fact, that a conquest subordinates the soul of the people. It has to be rekindled. And so this subjugation of the Indian spirit, he was acutely aware of it. And all his work, he tried to describe ways in which this subjugation of spirit manifested itself in different spheres of our public activity. He sketched the historical processes through which it happened. He has presented glimpses of various facets of Indian public life before Indian spirit was subdued, Indian mind enslaved, and he has meditated deeply on the ways out of this state of civilizational stupor so that Indian spirit and Indian mind may be set free again. So, Dharampal is roughly can be described as a Gandhian thinker, scholar, historian. He has authored several books on Indian, pre-British Indian society, polity, science, technology, etc. These books rigorously documented and disrupted the scholarly consensus that prevailed in 1970s and earlier about the backwardness and dysfunctionality of Indian society and its sciences, technologies. Sorry. So these 5-6 books are important. Some of them are available, I think, on our website, cpsindia.org. I'll talk about some of these books during the course of my presentation. So Dharampal was born in Kandla. He is actually Sri Dharampal Gupta. February 19, 1922, the family moved to Lahore. In 1940, he was studying BSc, abandoned college studies, to take part in the Quit India movement. He actually attended the historic occasion and the speech of Mahatma Gandhi in Bombay on August 9th, 1942, when the Quit India resolution was passed. He was briefly imprisoned in 1943. 44 to 46, he was with Miraben in a Kisan ashram in a village near Roorkee. 47-48, he was with Kamala Devi Chattopadhyaya, prominent public figure in India. Many of you may have heard her name. Ram Manohar Lohia, L.C. Jain, who was member of our planning commission sometime. 1948-49, he visited England and Israel. Israel mainly to see the village communities, kibbutzes there. But again with Miraben, he set up a village, Swavalamban Gram near Bapu Gram, near Rishikesh. 58 to 64, he was General Secretary of an organization which still exists. It's on the Deen Dayal Upadhyay Marg, Association of Voluntary Agencies for Rural Development, AWARD. It was founded by Jayaprakash Narayan ji as its president. In 62, he brought out his first book, which was a compilation of the debates in the Constituent Assembly on the issue of Panchayat Raj. On November 21, 1962, he, along with his friends Datta and Rup Narayan, he sent an open letter to all the 500 odd MPs criticizing Pandit Nehru's weak response to Chinese invasion. November 1962 was the period of. So they called upon the Prime Minister to resign if he is not willing to take responsibility for saving Indian territories and Indian people. He and his colleagues were interned in Tihar jail for a couple of months and released. 63 to 65, he undertook a survey of the functioning of panchayats, which were constituted as per the directive principles of our constitution, mostly in Tamil Nadu and also in some other parts of South India. 65, he left for England. He had married a British school teacher in 60s, and he started detailed exploration of archival records. Why did he start that? I will tell you during the course of it. Mainly in what is called the British Library. It was called British Museum earlier, now it's called British Library. And this work more or less non-stop till 1982, when he sort of shifted back to India. So the first book after the Panchayat Raj book was the Civil Disobedience in Indian Tradition. Next was Indian Science and Technology in the 18th century. There was also the report on the Panchayat survey that he did. All these were released in Delhi in 71-72. For a brief while he worked in Patna. It's an institution again founded by Jayaprakash Narayan called A.N. Sinha Institute. During emergency, he was in England and he sort of organized what is called the Save JP campaign. Then he, after returning to India, he first brought out a small report on the state of bonded labor. But how did the idea of bonded labor arose in India, forced labor and bonded labor in India during the British period? Since 1982, he stayed partly in Chennai and partly in Sevagram and talked in several institutions. I suppose he might have even visited Delhi IIT once or twice, giving lectures and talks. He was always keen to interact with students. 83, this book on Indian indigenous education in 18th century was published. He served as a fellow of Indian Council for Historical Research for 3 terms, 87 to 90, 91 to 94 and 99 to 2002. Some series lectures he gave because he didn't really write down the big book that he wanted to write, India and England, 1750 to 1950. So aspects of that book, he gave a series of lectures, once in Bangalore, once in Bikaner, once again, I think, in Wardha. They have been published as booklets. Then he wrote a small booklet on India's reacquiring its what he called the Chitta, Manas and Call of India. And he briefly served as the chairman of National Cattle Commission in 2001 and 2, passed away in 2026. So this first book on Panchayat Raj, I will say very few words about it because it was one of the important concerns of Dharampal ji. He brought out the Constituent Assembly, as you know, worked for about 2 years, from late 1946 till end of 1948. And this is published in about 6 volumes. It's also fully available on the net. It's a very important document because it will tell you the kind of discussion that took place on various aspects of the polity that they were going to bring about in independent India, the different views and different suggestions. So there was a very passionate debate on the idea of Panchayat Raj in that. And this gives a clear idea of the concern Dharampal ji about the classical polity of pre-British India. Because one crucial thing that people discussed within the first reading of the Constitution, which was sometime in early 1947, the draft Constitution was circulated, and by October, November, after independence, what is called the second reading of the Constitution took place. So in that, people found for the first time that individual and not grama or village was taken as the unit of the polity, meaning there was no statutory political authority associated with the grama in this scheme of things, that the Constitution, the draft Constitution. And this, everybody knew who had taken part in the independence struggle, that India had a hoary history of what is called the village self-government, Gram Swaraj, as Mahatma Gandhi used to call them. So that there was no attention paid to this, because all through the independence movement, this issue was emphasized, that when India becomes independent from the British, we will restore the grama as a basic constituent of the Indian polity. So many of them who took part in the debate were unhappy, and they sort of put this blame on the fact that the drafting of the Constitution was done without paying any attention to the classical Indian political thought and institutions. Their more serious complaint was that people who drafted the Indian Constitution went through several constitutions of the world, American Constitution, Swiss Constitution, British Constitution, even the Constitution of Ireland, but nobody thought about. There was some detailed scholarship on pre-British Indian polity that was available. Of course, it was realized at that stage, a big document has already been prepared. It was too late to reformulate the structure of independent India. So what was done was, a concession was given to the majority opinion in the Constituent Assembly, that one article was inserted, and that was inserted as a part of the non-enforceable directive principles. As you know, we have fundamental rights which can be judicially enforced, but the directive principles just gives suggestions to the state that it may do. So the states may constitute panchayats and give them adequate powers and finances, was the directive principle. So this is some aspect of that debate. So for instance, when the debate started, already there was some discussion in the newspapers that the draft Constitution does not reflect the ancient polity of India. So Ambedkar ji, Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar, took note of that in his initial speech while the second reading of the Constitution started. So he said, yes, we have made individual the unit of polity, and we have not included village panchayats as a part of the polity, because Ambedkar was of the opinion that the village communities have lasted long, but we cannot take any pride in them. They have survived through the vicissitudes, but the question is, on what plane have they survived? Surely on a low, on a selfish level, I hold that these village republics have been the ruination of India, and therefore surprised that those who condemn provincialism and communalism should come forward as champions of the village. I am glad that the draft Constitution has discarded the village and adopted the individual. Some similar sentiment was expressed. There was an earlier discussion in the Congress Working Committee in 1945 on the political and economic model that independent India should follow. Mahatma Gandhi there, his representatives, insisted that again village should be taken as the unit, and the village industry should form an important part of India's industrial and technological plan. And that didn't happen, and Mahatma Gandhi wrote a long letter to Jawaharlal Nehru, and Nehru wrote back more or less the same thing, that the village in your mind is very different from village that we have seen, and it's nothing but a den of ignorance and feud. But there were several others. As soon as Ambedkarji's starting speech happened, somehow the floodgates were opened, people were emotionally hurt. They had all through the independence movement thought that they are going to set up a new polity in India along the classical Indian lines. So several, I have just quoted Loknath Mishra and Srimati Dakshayani Velayathan. They paid high compliments to Dr. Ambedkar, but said that in this issue he seemed to have completely misunderstood and his opinion they were. And in fact, when the final reading of the constitution happened, sometime towards the end of 1948, most people expressed their sorrow that they were unable somehow, so much effort has gone into the preparing of this constitution, but somehow what we have brought about still does not reflect our aspirations, the aspirations of the great independence struggle. So K. Hanumanthaya, who later on became Chief Minister of Karnataka, so he says, when I look into the members of the drafting committee and see their names, I must say many of them are very respected names. Many of them were very able men, but only some of them were in sympathy with the independence movement. In fact, a majority of them had come there because they were practicing administrators or legal experts or advocates. So he ends up sort of lamenting like this, that we wanted the music of veena and sitar, but we have the music of the English band. So Dharampalji brought out this Constitution Assembly debate because there it was clearly said this constitution is for the immediate operation of independent India after almost a century or more of foreign rule. So we will attend to all this issue, and immediately around that time the partition of India was announced. These are troubled times. We will go through this and review this after a decade or so, was what Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru said in the Constituent Assembly and outside also. So in 64, Dharampalji in his travel around the villages and looking at the panchayats. So the panchayat article was there, it's Article 44 of the Constitution, that directive principle that the state shall enact and make panchayats and give them finances and administrative responsibilities. So in traveling in Tamil Nadu near Tanjavur, one elderly gentleman told Dharampalji that in Tanjavur till 1937, a system of community ownership of land used to be in practice in several of the villages of Tanjavur. These villages were called as Samudayam villages, and the system involved periodic redistribution of land amongst all the village landholders. Meaning that there could be some land which had better irrigation facilities, some land which has lesser irrigation facilities, some land which may be suitable for one crop. So this redistribution was to ensure justice amongst all the farmers there. So later on, Dharampalji looked up what is called the Tanjore District Manual. It was written in 1860s or 70, I think by Venkaswamy Naidu. And in that it is stated that in 1805, about 1/3 of the villages in the Tanjore district were Samudayam villages. It was not just a phenomenon specific to a more communitarian village. And the district manual also gives some agreement between the landholders done in 1864, because some outside chettiars had bought land and they were not willing to take part in this redistribution and all that. It tried to enforce the system that was traditionally used. I mean, there are about half a dozen such instances where Dharampal just tried to recount the kind of situation that prevailed in the panchayats that the government had brought about. The second one was in another village where he found the minute book, and it said that major decisions were passed by circulation. That means people didn't gather in the meeting, but the minute book was sent to everybody and the resolutions were written, people signed. So he asked why it didn't happen. So they said there are several communities and we find it difficult to go to anybody's house, and the village doesn't have enough public space for the panchayat. So Dharampalji asked, surely you could have gone to the school and held the meeting there, because at that time, even then, there was more or less one school in every village in Tamil Nadu. So the answer was that no statutory business as per the Government Act is possible. It cannot be conducted on a Sunday. And later on, Dharampalji, in his archival search, he discovered that this law goes back to a law passed in England in 1800. And this was a law that there should be a stricter observance of the Sabbath day. That is the day on which Christians have declared that that day they will spend in rest and prayer. Every week the Sunday will be kept. The Jews keep Saturday. So a stricter observance of Sabbath enforced that no public business could be done. Even public hanging of clothes, etc., was prohibited in England. And this law in England in 1800 had that long shadow on this small panchayat in Tamil Nadu villages in 1960s. The next book Dharampal wrote was, so basically that the indigenous Indian institutions were still governed under alien rules and alien norms. This was the main point that was brought up. So the next book was Civil Disobedience. This was actually the first book of Dharampal based upon his archival work. So this gives details of one detailed protest movement which looks like the later civil disobedience movement of 1920s, non-cooperation movement, or the civil disobedience movement of 1934, 31 to 34, Salt Satyagraha, etc. So this happened in Banaras first, but it spread to Patna, Saran, Murshidabad and Bhagalpur in Bihar. It happened in 1810 and 1811. It was against a new tax that the British imposed on every house and every shop. And Varanasi, as you know, half the houses were religious establishments. They were temples actually. So the people protested. They said having a house is an inalienable right and it cannot be taxed like water and air, they said in their petition. And they also said if the government is short of revenue, we will find some other way of making up that shortfall. But we cannot accept an unjust imposition of tax on houses. So this lasted a couple of months and finally the British did not withdraw the tax immediately because according to the British that would show a weakness on the part of the state if you concede to the demands of the people. So they did it within a year or so in 1812. So there is one description of this. Mahatma Gandhi in his Hind Swaraj has written that we are always passive resistors in India, and he quotes in Porbandar, in Saurashtra, some Raja did something which the people didn't like, and village after village deserted, and the king had to go and pacify them and bring them back. There is a much more detailed account of this 1810 civil disobedience, which is printed in a book which was published in 1909 when Mahatma Gandhi was in London. This is the first biography of Mahatma Gandhi, written by a person called Bishop Joseph Doak, who was in South Africa. So in this biography, he has given this account of the Varanasi Hartal, Varanasi movement. So this Bishop Heber, who wrote a journal in 1828, who passed through North India, so he is saying that how passive resistance was resolved after this decision. The news flew over the country like the fiery cross in the Lady of Lake. It's a famous poem of England. And 3 days after it was issued, and before the government were in least apprised of the plan, about 300,000 persons, as it is said, deserted their houses, shut up their shops, suspended the labor of their farms, forbore the light fires, dress victuals, that is cooking, making, many of them even to eat, and sat down with folded arms, drooping heads, like so many sheep on the plain which surrounds Benares. I think it was a long region from the river to Creole. So if we carefully look through the annals of Indian history, most of them are generally called peasant movements, protests, etc. You will see the way in which these movements were organized. You will see a great resonance with this movement in Varanasi or in the 20th century movement for India's independence. Now the fundamental issue at dispute here is that a government based on the consent of the people has been the foundational principle of Indian authority all through. This is the essence of democracy. I mean, entire Shanti Parva in Mahabharata discusses this principle in various ways. So civil disobedience, refusal to obey the laws or rules which are imposed that the people felt are against dharma and to accept the consequences. Refusing to obey the laws but agreeing to accept the punishment or consequences has always been practiced in India, and this was essential part of the civil disobedience movement of 20th century also. So this is just one instance, and I am sure if we study this kind of archival and other records, there will be several other instances of how the rural-ruled relation in India was more on a mutual engagement and consent, and even protest was an act of enforcing an engagement and consent and not a struggle or a war. So now I come to the central point, the Indian science and technology. This book was published in 71. It was released, I think, in Delhi by the president of the Indian National Science Academy, then Professor D.S. Kothari, and it was widely taken note of. It has about 17 articles. First 6 articles refer to science, mostly astronomy, mathematics. But it's the second part, 11 articles refer to diverse range of technologies. It has first an account of the astronomical instruments in Varanasi. I'm sure many of you would have heard of this place. It is just next to the Shashwamedh Ghat, which has been in news recently. It's called the Man Mandir Ghat. And in the 3rd floor of that is an astronomical observatory. And the British officer who wrote this account, generally it is thought this is one of the 5 observatories built by Raja Jai Singh in 18th century. But the gentleman who wrote this account, the Sir Robert Barker, he said that this was built during the time of Man Singh, that's at the time of Akbar, 200 years earlier, and was improved upon at the time of Raja Jai Singh, that is 1720s. So this first instrument is a gnomon, Samrat Yantra. The second one is a Dakshinottara Bhitti Yantra. Both are very standard astronomical instruments. You will see better version of them in Delhi here, in Jantar Mantar. This is Samrat Yantra in Jantar Mantar. This is that Jai Prakash and Ram Yantras in the Delhi. Now the important thing is these were built in the period 1720 to 1730. This was after the discovery of telescope, but these were highly accurate instruments for that time. So they were accurate up to what is called 1 minute of the arc, meaning 360 degrees. Each degree is converted into 60 minutes. So it is 1 by 360 into 60 of the circle. It's accurate up to that. So the height of these central gnomons were more than 100, so this is so tall. It's about 30 meters tall. The Delhi one is 27, I'll tell you the height of the Delhi one is 20 meters. The bigger one is 34 meters, and the height of the Jaipur one is 44 meters. That's about 132 feet. The 5 things that Raja Jai Singh, briefly we should know something about Raja Jai Singh, but if there was somebody called a man who started Indian resurgence in 18th century, he had a great part in it. So he is born in 1688. After the death of Aurangzeb, he sort of becomes somewhat more independent. In fact, he defeats the forces of Bahadur Shah in 1709, and he then performs what is called the Vajpayee Yajna. And by earlier itself, he has started working on astronomy. He acquires this teacher, Jagannath Ambekara from Maharashtra, because he is on a campaign to Maharashtra earlier in his young age. So he gets the jizya abolished by Mahmud Shah, the Delhi emperor, who becomes a nominal emperor actually, and then gets this land for building this observatory in Jantar Mantar. Today it's more known for the location where protest meetings are held. In 26 and 34, he organizes conference of various religious leaders, I think something in Galta and various other places. He builds this new capital, Jaipur, as per the classical Indian architectural principles of city construction. So one Vidyadhar Bhattacharya, this Sthapati was the main, and it has observatory, temples, Sanskrit college, everything as in the way. He dies in 1743. But his main achievements in astronomy and mathematics was that he tried to take the older books of India, older meaning books written in 15th, 16th century, and try to build this observatory to test them against observation. That's one of the crucial principles of Indian astronomy, that what is calculated and what is observed should tally. So you should have a good observational instrument. So these some huge instruments were constructed and he found that discrepancies are there. So he looked up the tables that had come from Central Asia, because the previous tables had come from the Tadhikara of Nasiruddin Tusi, and similar ones from, I think there was a Zid Shahjahani which was done in around 1650s. Again, there were discrepancies with what is observed. Then he got hold of some Jesuit and sent him to Paris to pick up the latest astronomical tables, what's called the De la Hire tables. And what he is doing is, he is trying to compare the calculations in all these systems and improve what is called the ancient Surya Siddhanta system of calculation. And so he writes letters to Jesuits saying, see, I have made these observations, I am getting these discrepancies. How do you explain this? What is this correction that you have made? So here is a man, instead of saying, I will throw away Surya Siddhanta, which is 600 years or 500 years old or whatever years old, he tried to update it, not only by his own observations, but by looking at whatever other current developments are there all over the world. And of course, unfortunately, he passed away in 1743, and the Indian polity went through much more convulsions later. Okay, so Dharampalji's book has another mention of somebody called Williams in 1793, who is saying, no, this observatory hardly was used. It's only used to tie horses as a stable. It was not, nobody made any observations there. But he also adds this comment that till 1820, I think, this Man Mandir was talked about as one of the 5 greatest observatories in the world. But its situation, even at the time when Robert Barker went to see it in 1772, was in a tragic case. And Dharampalji says it's tragic that one of the 5 celebrated observatories in the world, as per Encyclopedia Britannica till 1820, though still intact, still remains in state of neglect. Its counterparts in Britain, France, etc. are greatly cherished and serve as the repositories and centers of their respective astronomical heritage. India owes that much to itself and its people that places like Man Mandir are duly cherished. I mean, one of the observatories is no longer there. The one in Mathura was destroyed around 1830s due to some British policy. The other 4 are still there. But if you go to Man Mandir, you will still see that its situation is not something that we can showcase to the rest of the world. Then there's an article by Playfair, which is a review article on Indian astronomy in 1790, where Playfair thinks that the accuracy of Indian calculations, which go back to 3100 BCE, is spectacular. And he thinks this is not possible because there was no Newton amongst Indians, there was no Lagrange amongst Indians. I mean, these are the recent astronomical greats in Europe. And so he sort of proposes that maybe Indians were doing observations in 3100 BCE, because most of the Indian astronomical texts use 3102 BCE as its epoch. That's called the beginning of Kali Yuga. Anyway, this was written in 1790, but in 20-25 years, European opinion changed thoroughly, and Laplace, in his famous book of 1829, says that the tables do not indicate, they of course indicate a high knowledge of astronomy, but the ancientness of Indian astronomy is not really guaranteed in that. Only recently we have started really finding extraordinary evidences of ancientness of Indian astronomy. This is a diagram which shows the position of the pole star, that if you extend the axis of the earth to the sky, the point where it meets the sky can be called the north celestial pole. If there's a star sitting at that position, you will call it a pole star. But what happens is, the Earth's axis, which is tilted with respect to the plane in which Earth is going around, it's tilted, it's not perpendicular to the plane in which Earth is going around the sun. It sort of does what is called precession, like a top when it's before it falls. It sort of does this kind of a precession. But it's a precession which takes 26,000 years to go through 360 degrees amongst all the stars. So in 1 year it goes to, in 1 degree it will change by 72 years it will take to change by 1 degree. So a pole star which was there in 2800, which I am showing here, that is what the Indians saw. This is called Thuban in today's astronomy. It was the star which was called the Dhruva in Indian text called Taittiriya Aranyaka and in Puranas. But it ceased to be a pole star in 300-400 years later due to precession. Today we have a star which is very close to the north celestial pole, which we call as Dhruva. We show it in the sky. If Delhi, which is maybe 26-27 degrees latitude, it's above the horizon, that much. So this is called Alpha Ursa Minoris today. It will be exactly near the pole 30 years from now, around later half of 21st century. There was another great French astronomer who visited Pondicherry in late 18th century. So he met with the Indian astronomers, and one, I think, Swami Muthu, a Tamilian astronomer, who said, I will calculate eclipses for you. So Legentil called him and told him, let us fix one particular eclipse and you sit down and calculate it for me. I use my tables and compare it with that. So this man came, and within about 50 minutes, he completed the calculation. He didn't bring any book. He brought a set of cowrie shells to do the calculation. He had various formulae in his mind. And Legentil then wrote down that the method that the astronomer followed, it gave 41 seconds too short, whereas the European table gave 1 minute 8 seconds too long. Similarly, for the totality, this is for the duration of the central part of the eclipse. For the totality of the eclipse, again, both are of comparable accuracy. But the crucial thing was, Legentil says, they did their astronomical calculations with swiftness and remarkable ease, without pen and pencil. Their only accessories were cowrie shells. The method of calculation appears to me to be more advantageous in that it is faster and more expeditious, because Indian astronomy always looked for accurate but easily calculable methods. Anyway, there is another report of John Warren that these Kerala astronomers who had found their infinite series that penetrated to Pondicherry also, that this series for pi by 4 was told to John Warren. But the British official to whom John Warren sent this information, he said that the pretensions of Hindus to such a knowledge of geometry is too ridiculous to deserve refutation. Of course, the person who wrote an article on this, Charles Wish, did manage to write an article on it 10 years later. There is a review of Colebrook's Indian algebra. Again, he is talking of Indian solution of what is called quadratic indeterminate equation. And he says they have reached almost as high heights as was reached by Lagrange in 1770, who gave a systematic solution of that equation called the Pell's equation in 1770s. But current scholarship has shown that the Indian method, which is called Chakrawala, was indeed always leading to a solution. So it was the most general solution also, but it was being done in about 30% of steps, number of steps less than the Lagrange method, or the Lagrange method used about 40% steps more than the Indian method. Anyway, so these matters about Indian science are more known because there has been a more detailed scholarship of Indian mathematics and astronomy even after the early part of 18th century. That continues, and we are aware of many more things. But as regards the prevalence of technologies and their efficacy, there are not that many modern accounts. These 18th century accounts are indeed therefore very important for us. The astronomy and mathematics things started some controversy, so there was more debate afterwards. So on the 11 articles, there is one on the inoculation against smallpox, 3 on the method of manufacture of iron, 2 on making specific materials, hemp and paper, 1 on making of mortar, 1 on making of ice, then 2 articles on agriculture at that time. Now, there is something called the drill plow that distributes the seeds while you are plowing. This was considered a recent innovation by the British in late 18th century. They widely saw that in different parts of the India, so they wrote down sketches and sent it to England. Now, this Indian practice of inoculation. Inoculation means today we use vaccination, which comes from the infection that has been from the cow, which has gotten the infection, vaka meaning the cow, which was discovered by Jenner in late 18th century. But much earlier than that, the practice of inoculation was widely practiced, known in India and in places as remote as Turkey also. And Governor Halwell, who was governor in Bengal, he was also an important surgeon. Once he goes back, he gives a talk in the Royal College of Surgeons in England, and he describes this Indian method of vaccination. So one is it's widely practiced. So people from Vrindavan, Ayodhya, Kashi, and many other places go around villages. They go with the pustules from the previous year, and there's a specific regimen, and the inoculation is done. And then they stay there for a couple of years, observe the effects, and then they go to the next village. So Halwell says, when the before recited treatment, he gives a very detailed account of the whole method. When the before recited treatment of the inoculated is strictly followed, it is next to a miracle to hear that 1 in a million fails of receiving the infection, and of 1 that miscarries it. Meaning, the purpose of inoculation is you should get a mild fever so that you get immunity. Of course, you should not have a miscarriage that you should actually get the smallpox. So they take the invalidated pustules from the previous year and do that. And again, he talks about the way Indians understood it. They said that the primary cause of smallpox, of course, is in our body. But the immediate cause comes from minute cremies, as we call them today. They call them, Halwell calls them animalculae floating in the atmosphere. What you later on became known as the germ theory of disease was the widely spread understanding of the origin of smallpox. Now, of course, once vaccination became known in Europe, the British banned the practice of inoculation both in several parts of India. There were accounts of surgery. So all of you know, I think nowadays it's more widely written, that plastic surgery was practiced in India. There was an account in 1794 in a British magazine of a Maratha soldier whose nose was cut off by Tipu Sultan, and how it was sort of restored by Indian method of plastic surgery. And then a British expert came to India and studied this and started the practice in 1810 in England. Now there is one Dr. Helena Scott who is going around India in 1790s itself. So he takes up this cement, or we use that cement to sort of paste the nose on the affected part. So that cement, he takes the sample and circulates it to the president of British Royal Society. But the most interesting and important thing were the accounts on Indian iron and steel. About 3 articles are there. The furnaces are described. I think we have some photographs here. Their dimensions are given. Their output is given. How much of charcoal is used, how much of ore is used, what quality of iron comes, and all that. So they were studied actually in great detail by British observers, and by the various accounts that are available in different parts of India, especially in South India and Central India, making of iron and steel was very common. We all know of this Indian steel, which is called woods in 18th century. It's called urukku in Tamil, ukku in Kannada. So this was used for Damascus sword, and it was given as a prize to Alexander and all that. But this woods is also talked about. And there is an account by Faraday, I think. James Studart, who collaborated with Faraday in 1820s, he is saying the woods of India promises to be of importance to the manufacturers of this country. I am of the opinion that it would prove a source of considerable revenue to the country. To the country meaning England. I have at this time a liberal supply of woods, and I intend to use it for many purposes. If a better steel is offered to me, I will gladly attend to it. But the steel of India is decidedly the best I have yet met with. So this is a report that is published in the tracts of 1813. But the original article of report of Benjamin Hayne was first given to a person called George Pearson. He was a metallurgist in England. And he did an experiment on the sample of woods that was sent to England in 1790s. And he writes an article in the famous journal, Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society. And so the person who sent this wood said, the steel of India is the best I have yet met with. It was changed, and the statement was changed to, it has a harder temper than anything known in that part of India, as a quotation from the person who had written. Meaning, even at that time, 1795, the scientists and technologists of England were extremely reluctant to acknowledge that anything in India would be of that distinct nature. So Dharampal just tried to make some general remarks. One is that the 17th, 18th, 19th century European view of society and of science, technology, politics, etc. are diametrically at variance with the views held by non-European societies till then. Consequently, the sciences and technologies of non-European world had different seekings and different developments than Europe. And in countries like India, which had a more decentralist politics, the practice was widespread at every local level. And so the idea was to have small instruments. They were called crude by the British, but they were really of exact proportions. Their appearance was not sophisticated, but they had the kind of necessary proportions and necessary efficacy. So Dharampalji's view, which I think today many more historians accept, that after about 150 years of Mughal rule in North India, 18th century was a time when India was trying to slowly come back into its own. And that process, of course, was stunted and halted by the British conquest of India. So that's all right. We are now in the post-British era. But according to Dharampalji, what has developed in India in the field of science and technology during the past century, and at a much greater pace since 1947, is mainly a transplanting of some of that, he is writing in 1971, which was developed during this period in the European world. Such transplanting has not happened not only at the level of theories, but even more so as regarding the organization and the direction, and including, I think, instruments and many times the personnel also. So it is largely due to transplanting and unthinking acceptance that though many individual Indian scientists and technologists are as creative and as innovative as their colleagues in the European world, the impact of this science and technology on the larger society of India is in fact minimal. It's perhaps no exaggeration to add that the field of science and technology in India, as far as it concerns its ordinary life, is only little less barren than India's state system and politics. Okay. Anyway, he says the problem for India today, and perhaps for many other lands, I think they have learned that lesson, which are recovering from the effects of 18th and 19th century European dominance, is how to achieve and increase innovation and creativity. Such innovation and creativity can arise only from a widespread indigenous base. That is, Japan, when it started modern metallurgical industries, it involved, of course Japan was a free country then in 18th century and early 19th century, it involved a large number of metallurgical craftsmen and artisans in its emerging new industry. So they were trained in new methods, and their wisdom could be passed on to their skills could be passed on to the new entrants in this also. So in order to increase innovation and creativity, a knowledge and comprehension of how the sciences and technologies functioned before the European dominance seems to be essential. Even for purposeful adaptations from the European, or for that matter, what is now happening, Chinese or other technologies, and their integration with the more indigenous concepts and knowledge forms, it is necessary that these countries, that is countries which have become free after colonialism, reacquire and achieve such knowledge about their own indigenous capacities as early as possible. This is what he wrote in 71. I think that has much valid today also. And it so happens Dharampalji thought that all these will create some revelation, and earth will turn around and people will realize that Indian technology and science were functional just 150, 200 years ago, and we will sort of rediscover many things. So unfortunately no such thing happened. It became reasonably well known, and it became one of the points which were occasionally discussed in our discourse. So now it's up to the youngsters now to reflect on this in a more positive way. You see, there is Dharampalji was just a one-man army, and he collected 20 notable papers. But Indian youngsters are brimming with enthusiasm to discover not only India's past, but exceed it in the contemporary times, make leaps and bounds from that. So there's huge archival material that is available. Of course, we can always say the government should do a national mission and various IITs should be involved and all this. But it's the initiative of individuals that will set into motion that kind of practice. So Dharampalji's curiosity about pre-British India and its functionality led him to this exploration. So it's not just some information, it's something that we as technologists have to reflect, that why don't we know better about this. So basically what I had seen was, I think even on iron and steel making, there are about 200 articles in all over the world in journals, about 50 of them in 18th century, about 100 of them in 19th century. But there are even some 20, 30 of them in 21st century on old Indian methods of iron making, experiments with the surface, experiment with the furnace, experiments with the wood steel composition, even understanding of the Delhi iron pillar, or the several other important iron objects all over India. There are many, many investigations, and all that it needs is us to seek for the literature and look for it and take this subject forward. There is one technology that Dharampalji's book didn't deal with, that is agriculture. It has dealt with. I will not say much about it right now. I will say something about it later in this talk. So the crucial thing was textiles was the most important material that India exported. From 1500, once Europeans started dominating what is the Indian Ocean, the textile trade was the major trade. And India was producing about 25% of world's textiles. India was producing 1/3 of all the textiles exported in the world trade. So this was the kind of thing. In fact, currently the scholars say India clothed the world. Of course, we see statements like this, but this from one volume, which has about half a dozen articles on the textile trades from various parts of India in 16th to 18th century. But what it needs is an enormously more detailed study. What were these fabrics? How were they produced? How were they dyed? Why did they catch the world market? So all these things. Now I'll just give you something which perhaps many of you may know partially but may not know fully. So this is a subject that became important in late 20th century. That what was the manufacturing output of different countries from say 18th century to 20th century. So the first such detailed study was done by a Belgian economist called Paul Bayrock. And one thing that many of you might have heard, that in 1750, 25% of the world's manufacturing output was from India, and about 32%, 33% was from China, and the whole of Europe had about 23%. USA 0.1, Japan 3.8, individual European countries, UK 1.9. So, after colonization, India's output decreased very fast. 1800 in 19.7 in 1800, 17.6 in 1830, and almost 2.8 by 1880. China did not get directly colonized, but after 1840s, its entire coastline and external regions were under foreign control. And so after 1860, you will see a decline in fact, even 1830s, you will see a fast decline in China. So it also comes down to about 2.3 in 1953. This is the share of world manufacturing output. And then you can see Europe increases to 62% by 1900, and United States increases to 44% in 1953. Perhaps you would have seen this data, but now what is equally important is you should see what is the current situation. That in 23-24, China is producing 27.7% of world's manufacturing output. United States is 17.3, Europe 16.8, individual countries, UK is 1.8, Germany 4.9, Japan 5.2, India is 2.9. So, all this information, if it has to prod us into something, is that we have to ensure that in the next couple of decades, India acquires that kind of manufacturing presence. India is roughly about, we have 800 crore people in the world, we are about 150. So we are 1/5 of the world population. So at least we should be in the 20% bracket in world's manufacturing. We are a great manufacturing country. We have to regain that. This beautiful tree is the next book. If you want to ask me some questions, I can stop here for a few minutes. Or shall we proceed? Yes, sir.
As we could see on the last slide, that India's manufacturing did not increase that significantly even after we got independence. So, what do you consider the reasons for this? Are these political reasons or policy reasons, or are these something that we did not go back to our roots and manufacture the same way that we used to manufacture?
No, it's we as a society are responsible for this. Some portion will be policy, some portion will be our neglect of our own indigenous resources, talents of our people and all that. But something would be some wrong economic philosophies that the world goes by all the time. So there are three major sectors of economy. One is called agriculture and allied portions. Next is called manufacturing and mining and manufacturing. Next is called services. So we are supposed to have leapfrogged the manufacturing part of the economic growth, and to quite an extent even the agricultural part, as I will come and show you later, agricultural part of the economic growth, and became strong in services. But that doesn't work, because services in itself you will have to export. Unless you have a strong manufacturing base, you will not be. Today what we are talking about, we are going to buy $500 billion of from imports from other countries. Much of it is the hardware for our services to become fully AI competent. So it's a combination of everything. Yes, sir.
But similarly, I remember long time back reading one of your papers on there was differences between Indian science and modern Western science or Greco-Roman.
So this I will talk on the last day of this course, on Saturday. Whenever this course lecture is there, we will discuss that issue specifically. Yes, sir.
How much of this is related to not going back to Japan? You were telling that they went back to their roots. They started from where they left. How much of this is related to language? Because English is adopted as a language of higher education, and we lost touch with our, our own languages.
Yes, yes.
What is the role played by the language?
No, it's mutual. That having English also correspondingly our much of higher manufacturing education goes into the what is called the algorithmic and the computer science branch, rather than all the hardware that is involved in knowing the materials, knowing the processes becomes secondary. And this is what many of our people who are doing practical work are fully in hand with. But that communication is also lacking, that they are not able to communicate with these experts. So all this is there. The idea that higher education should be done in English goes back to mid 19th century. And we have tried to reverse it a little bit, but it is still a long process to go the way we are going. So Beautiful Tree is the book on the education. So there was a widespread system of primary and higher education prevalent in India, even in early 19th century, even in those areas which had come under British rule. Now, this became known by various surveys. I mean, today we are able to see the details by looking at various surveys that was done. So there was a detailed survey of 21 districts of Madras Presidency. Madras Presidency is a huge area. It's whole of Madras, whole of current Andhra Pradesh, that is old coastal Andhra, northern part of Kerala, that is called Malabar, and portions of Mysore and portions of Orissa, the Ganjam district. So this district, a very detailed survey was done. There was some survey by a missionary called Adam, who was a friend of Lord William Bentinck, of education in 5 districts of Bengal Presidency. There is a survey done in Maharashtra also, but a very detailed survey. Punjab came under British rule only in 1840s. So a survey of the indigenous education that survived in Punjab in 1880s by a man called Leader. Dharampalji's book has a summary from all these things. And this came into public light when Mahatma Gandhi, when he went to England for the Round Table Conference, he gave a speech in a place called Chatham House, which is I think one of the think tanks of England. So he said, what we will do after India becomes independent. That was the main topic of that speech. So he said, today, that is in 1931, India is more illiterate than it was 50 or 100 years ago. And so is Burma. Because the British administrators, when they came to India, instead of taking hold of things as they were, began to root them out. They scratched the soil and began to look at the root and left the root like that, and the beautiful tree of education perished. In the end, he also says, we give the medical aid not through the expensive modern Western medicine, but we revive our old ancient treatment. Every village had its own doctor, etc., etc., all those things. Now, in early 19th century, the fact that there was school in every village is widely recorded in various accounts. Thomas Munro, giving his statement to House of Commons in 1813, said that there is a school in every village. Similarly, there is a dispatch from England to Calcutta which says that education in India is provided for by a certain charge, that means certain tax or revenue, upon the produce of the soil and other endowments in favor of the village teachers. In fact, the popular education actually starts only in 19th century in England. Before that, people were going to school occasionally, mostly Sunday schools in the church or some night schools. It's the Industrial Revolution which sort of needed more literate skills from people that elementary education started. And even the method that was learnt by 2 people called Bell and Lancaster in India, they observed in Madras Presidency that a single teacher would be teaching 4 classes. And much of the teaching would be done by senior students to the juniors, what's called the monitor system. So this was taken and transplanted in England. So that's how India became a cause for greater literacy in England in 19th century. So what Munro found was, there was about 11,575 schools and 1,094 colleges in Madras Presidency. And the total population was 12 million. And so if the schools, these were the elementary schools, basic schools, 5 years to 7 years of teaching. So the population of that would be 1/18th of the total population. So he estimated that about 22, 23% or 25% of boys of school going age were studying. But then Monroe says most children were also educated at home. They were not going to these public schools. So this number is more like 1/3. So this Monroe's data, how many schools and how many were no, just one second. So Monroe's one collector collected data about people being educated at home. Educated at home does not mean parents teaching. It is some teacher coming and teaching them at home. So here you see that if 28% were educated at home, only 7% were educated in schools for Brahmins. Similarly, 23 and 15, 28 and 67, 13 and 8. So, even for most castes, the number who were totally educated was more than double, if not triple, of the number that were educated in schools. So if you take this, there was only one district which did this survey. You can see that the number would be much larger than 1/3. It could be perhaps a very large fraction of the boys. Of course, the girls were supposed to be educated at home. The details of that are not there in this survey. In the northern Kerala, many of them went to school also. But equally important was the percentage of students from different communities. The Monroe survey asked the collectors to write down how many students were from the Brahmin Varna, how many were from Kshatriya, how many from Vaishya, how many from Shudras, how many from other communities. And so in the Madras presidency, that is Tamil area, 62.3% of all the students were Shudras and 14.21 from the other communities, by which is meant what we today call as the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. So in the entire presidency, half the number of students were Shudras, 15% were from the other communities. So this was the kind of community makeup. So the schools were more inclusive than they were in the rest of 19th century. In fact, it's only in the last 50 years that we have created that kind of inclusion in school education. Then Dharampalji's book is also giving from Adams' report a table of teachers in the Bengal presidency. And so the table lists that 95 Hindu castes of teachers amongst the teachers. And it lists 95, 95 castes among students and 35 castes among the teachers. So the teachers also came from diverse communities, something which perhaps has not happened to that extent even today in India. Much more important for us today than, of course, this fact that it was inclusive should come as an eye-opener for all those people who believed that public education was a boon given to India by the British for most of Indian children. But what is very relevant today, that is removing a certain myth that has been created amongst us. Okay, because we have sorted out that problem, that elementary education today is widely available and is inclusive in India. Even higher education to a fairly significant extent. The crucial thing was, in 5 years, this system of education ensured that the children had the basic competence to be good citizens of the community. And for that, the basic competence in language and basic competence in arithmetic. So what we call as literacy and numeracy, this is what was ensured by this system of education in 5 years. So the collector of Bellary, called Campbell, is explaining the whole thing. And the crucial thing is the great emphasis that is placed on teaching language. The children are made to write and immediately pronounce the letter, then say it in a group. Verses are read in the class. They are made to write small paragraphs. They are made to remember multiplication and even addition tables, recite them. So all this we have given up, saying this is called rote education today. Rote education is something thought of to be rotten education, that everything the children should discover by themselves is the philosophy. So we don't want adults to discover most things by themselves. We want children of the age group 7 to 12 to discover. If they learnt all that, they can discover a lot more by themselves all through their lives. So this detailed thing is there. I will be circulating this note. You can read this. It reads like a beautiful essay on the pedagogy that was followed. If you look up other literature, I am sure you will get much more information on this pedagogy. So basically, the economy with which children are taught to write in the native schools, and the system by which the more advanced scholars are caused to teach the less advanced, the one thing I told you, and at the same time to confirm their own knowledge is certainly admirable and well deserved the imitation it has received in England. In 1825 already, the collector Campbell in Bellary knew that in England they had adopted this monetary system. In fact, there are many other accounts. In Bombay, one member of the council, he says the capacity of Indian children in 5 years of a cultivator's son to know the entire mathematics that is needed for cultivation and also language is remarkable. We are not able to teach it in that kind of a period in Europe. And the main idea was that the boy girl becomes a good part of the community. So they are taught the common literature of their heritage through language and arithmetic and other mathematics, geometry, or whatever is needed for their profession. And its importance I need not emphasize. The recent National Educational Policy says that in 2020, a large proportion of students currently in elementary school, estimated to be 5 crore. I think the total number of students in first 5 to 6 years of school may be about 20 crores or 30 crores, have not attained foundational literacy and numeracy. And these numbers are much bigger in several states. The highest priority of the education system should be given to universal foundational literacy and numeracy by 2025. We have of course crossed that limit, but still it's a task that is before us. Then about higher education, there is not that many detail. In Malabar, there are about 1,594 students learning in under various experts, scholars. They are calling them senior scholars who function as colleges. And you can see the number in astronomy is very large, 808. So tomorrow when I talk to you, day after tomorrow on Kerala School of Astronomy and its sort of importance, you will know how much astronomy was important in Kerala society. Medicine is very large. There is a fair amount of girl students there, but it's also distributed over all communities, except for I think theology and law, which I think Vedas and Puranas and things like that. Even in Bengal, there were people study what Adam surveyed. All sorts of technical literature was studied, grammar, logic, law literature. Those were the kind of subjects studied in Bengal. And the kind of textbooks they studied, Adam has given a detailed report of the textbooks used. And you can see in logic or grammar, etc., it would be 17th century classics that are being studied in 18th century. Then there is this Navadvipa, Nadia, so which functioned almost like a university. University meant large number of senior scholars at one place and students coming and studying with them. So in 1791, there were 1,100 students and 150 teachers. And it is said that in 1680, students were 4,000. And Navadvip, as you know, produced all the great stalwarts of Navya Nyaya and Navya Vyakarna. And in 1829, there were only 25 scholars and 500 students studying with them. And no wonder this great pronouncement of Macaulay, who declared that all Indian learning is worthless, and therefore we have to decide whether we teach them medical doctrines which would disgrace an English farrier, that is a horse doctor, astronomy which would move laughter in girls in English boarding school, history abounding with kings 30 feet high and reigns 30,000 years, and geography made of seas of treacle and seas of butter. So you can see similar sort of statements even here, that even today about Indian learning. And he emphasizes the natives are desirous to be taught English and are not desirous to be taught Sanskrit or Arabic. And therefore we stop all grants to these schools. Anyway, these grants were not much at that time. Now, the way he said natives are serious is because of certain sentiment which many educated Indians, highly nationalist and patriotic, they also thought that somehow something was wrong with ancient Indian learning. And one of the persons who whose opinion on this is widely known is Rajaram Mohan Rai, who wrote to the Governor General Lord Amherst 10 years before Macaulay's Minutes. And he said that government has set apart 1 lakh rupees for education. This should not be kept for Arabic or Sanskrit learning. We should teach children in English modern science and knowledge, natural sciences, chemistry taught by English gentlemen. And so he sort of says this Sanskrit language is so difficult that a lifetime is necessary for its perfect acquisition. And similarly, the Sanskrit system of education would be best calculated to keep this country in darkness. So even eminent people, great patriots and nationalists, were reduced to this state by the propaganda that Bacon had created some revolution and England had proceeded in leaps and bounds, and whatever is taught in India was only hair-splitting words, which is what Bacon said about ancient European learning. Now, how was this education supported? So again, the Bellary collector writes in detail that at that time, a small fees was collected from children. But of course, he says, higher education even then was free. In the sense that if you are a great teacher, and these great teachers were all in small villages all over the country. So a student will go to a great Vyakarana Pandit in some small village whose fame is known, and if that teacher takes him as a teacher, he will stay with him in his house, and the entire village will support the students, so he can have food from different houses, or food is sent, or he can go and take food. And so the village community still supported this great scholar in that way, because the other support that used to come from the earlier state system was no longer available. But even in 1830s, the higher education was free. And he says, the Bellary collector, of the 533 institutions of education now existing in this district, I am ashamed to say that not one now derives any support from the state. So now we have to dig back and see how this system was supported earlier. And of course, he himself says that no doubt in former times, especially under Hindu governments, he's saying Hindu governments because in 1823 it has come under it has been out of the 40 years of Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan's rule. Large grants of money, and both in money and land, were issued for support of learning. Considerable yomayas, grants of money, now paid to Brahmins from my treasury, and many of the numerous Shrotriam villages, etc., were all there. Anyway, now we are in a position to know much more about the village level economy, where what money was, what grains or what allocations were made to various scholars. And we see something I will say perhaps tomorrow morning in some greater detail, that these grants were given not just to Brahmins, they were given to all teachers and all scholars and all functionaries in the village and intra-village level. The crucial contrast between the British system of education and Indian one is that the Indian one is completely autonomous from the local level, but it is culturally integrated with the larger scholarly and educational philosophy of the country. The British system was producing a new scheme which is totally centralized, both financially and scheme-wise, curriculum-wise. Something that many countries outside India still are trying to break away from and have local initiative in one thing or the other. But at least in India, it has become so centralized in terms of its conception and execution. This is one of the major contrasts with them. So we can stop for 5 minutes and have some question on this. Then I will move on to the society part, last 10-15 minutes only. Let's have some questions for 5 minutes and then spend some more time on. So in this entire survey of education, what is most crucial is the pedagogy of it in the elementary level. Equally crucial is the kind of scholarship that is recorded. In various small villages, this kind of colleges existed, this kind of learning existed, how widespread it was, what purposes it served. So those are the kind of things which we need to. We will have many ancestors of many of our own people who will be sort of doing this kind of a major service in society, that the society valued very highly. Yes, sir.
So, in sort of for scientific treatises, we know a lot of them from ancient India. For example, if I want to study medicine, let's say, and compare it with the modern system of medicine, then I have a Charaka and so on and so forth. For architecture and Shilp Shastra also there are there. My own research is into machine design, and I wanted to know, sir, is there any text which sort of in systematically talks about technological design per se in ancient or medieval India?
No, I think when we talk of what is known, it is what scholars have looked into in terms of the manuscripts or the teaching tradition that continued, and they're able to edit those into books, and some of them are available to us. Whereas this will be different kind. You will have to go to the diaries and personal papers of people if you want to look into this kind of information. Even on great temples, there are records. I will show in the day after tomorrow that the detailed drawing maps of the Konark temple are kept, and they have been published in the early 1980s. Of course, they have not been studied by our engineers. The diagrams, the design is all there of the Sun Temple in Konark. So I am sure it will be there. Essentially, they will be with the communities, and we will have to get that kind of information in there. Even for Vaidyas also, there are a lot of diaries and that kind of information, apart from the older great treatises, which have enormous amount of information.
So, at least in, let's say, in medicine or this thing, they have classical treatises, which like
But the classical treatises were always supplemented by the practical manuals of the Vaidyas, which were also, even in astronomy, it is the tables that the people prepared out of the great Siddhantic texts that were valuable for further correction and things like that.
But in your memory, do you have any sort of technological sort of tech design text?
No, as I told you, it will be, I mean, something is there in Yuktikal Pataru. I can give you 4 or 5 texts which you will also know. So, not something that is not come in the notice. I think the chemical instruments are all described in Rasa Shastra texts of various kinds. Things like that are there. So, now I go to the last part, what Dharampalji had to say on Indian society prior to British rule. So, towards late in his life, he got hold of some very detailed records. These were some surveys of villages done in 1763 in Madras region, when this region was transferred to the British by the Arcot Nawab. And before taking that, the Arcot Nawab gave some details of what is the revenue that's expected from these villages. And using it, the British sent a team to go around the villages and check the accounts in the village. They also wanted to do a military survey, topographical survey of the land and all that. So that was also done by a person called Barnard. I think he was about 19 years then, 1763. But 17 years in 1763. But he did it between 1767 and 74, between his 21st year and 38th year, of about 2,000 villages. So while doing this, he found, because he had a Dubash with him, Dubash meaning a local interpreter, who told him there is nothing much to do. You have to go to the local village Karnam, or what is called the Kayastha in North India, or the Kanakapillai in Tamil Nadu, Karnam in Andhra, Karanika in Karnataka, the village accountant. They are having the accounts. And so they did indeed get detailed description of the village maintained by these Karnams. And they were much more than mere revenue accounts. That the entire land of the village covered, what was all the, how many ponds, how many tree groves, how many threshing grounds, how much wasteland, how much wetland, how much dry land, where are canals are there, how many houses, extent of each house, communities that live in each of those houses, name of the head of the householder, then production for 5 years, then what is done with that production, detailed account of all this. So these 2,000 were summarized in the form of land revenue registers in Tamil Nadu State Archives, which Dharampalji had copied about 50 to 100 villages, and he wrote something on them, which I'll tell you in the end. But now we know all the details. So for instance, if you take about 1910 villages and aggregate the land data, you see that about 13% are under water reservoirs. They are called as Aries, Tangals, Kulams, etc. in South India, Talab. 17% was under wood. Cultivable land was only half of the total land. So if you see the map of this Changalpet region, you will see these entire blue areas. So they are the water reservoirs and they are all facing this way. The bund is here and the overflow from this goes to this and that. So the overflow from this goes to here. So they are all an interconnected system of tanks. This 1950 revenue map of this district. And in Karnataka, in the old Mysore state, one engineer called Sankey made a survey and he found that the old Mysore state had 29,500 square mile area. It had 38,000 tanks. But the crucial thing was this was a chain of tanks. And so Sankey says, to such an extent has the principle of storage been followed that it would now require some ingenuity to discover a site within this great area suitable for a new tank. While restorations are of course feasible, that means silting, desilting, repairing the bund, repairing the outflow mechanism and all that. Any absolutely new work of this description would within this area be almost certainly found to cut off the supply of another, meaning you can neither add nor subtract one from it. But this was the entire topography of the region. And these tanks were managed by village communities. So this is the kind of cohesion with which the communities operated, and this is the kind of knowledge they together had of the entire topography of the land, that the water, usually monsoon lasts for 2-3 months, both in North India and South India. South India, it comes in 2 spurts in the coastal Madras, little bit in June, July, but more so in November, December. So that was the kind of, so when you said, when Dharampalji said it is more in tune with our seekings, technologies, etc., it is these kind of things. You follow nature, but you try to see that no water unnecessary flows to the sea. It's not that water should not flow to the sea, but whatever can be collected during the rainy season is collected for the entire year. So this is what made a high level of production possible. So this is what I wanted to tell you, that these about 1,500 localities produced about 2 lakh tons, and the productivity is about 2.85 metric tons per hectare in the wetland, 0.95 metric tons per hectare in the dry land. And the total cultivation, it was about 2.2 metric tons, which is about the kind of productivity we have for food grain cultivation in rice and wheat on the average in India today. But more than that, what they had was that the production per household was about 1 metric ton per person. Today we have about 1 metric ton per household, meaning we are producing about 200 kilograms per person per year. The production then was about 4-5 times then. So here is some data for today. India has a very large area under food grains, about 135 million hectares. China has 102, USA has 50, world has 731. So we are about 1/5 of the world's food grain land. But the total food grains we are producing, fortunately it's going up now, but even now it's about 320 million tons. China is producing about 570. USA is producing 400. USA has 1/4 the population of India. China has more or less the same population as India. Asia, about 1,300. But what is crucial is the yield of food grain and production per capita. So yield of food grains in India is today around 2.4 metric tons. It was only 1.7 in 2001 and it was 0.7 tons in 1961. But if you compare it with Asia, Asia's yield of food grains is 3.8 metric tons. So, per hectare. Similarly, per capita, India is producing only around 200, 220 now, because the rate of growth of our population has come down also. The per capita has increased a little bit. Otherwise, also it's increasing. Whereas China is double. World average is more than 40% or 50% more than the Indian. So this again another indicator that we have to actually catch up better with our past, in the sense that for us to think of ourselves as an affluent economy and society, where animals are also fed well, humans are also fed well, you have enough grain for which is going as waste also. So all this taken into account, we have to produce much more than 200 kilograms per person per year, which was thought of to be the minimum required to avoid famine deaths during the British time. So per capita production has not gone up too much above what can be called the threshold level in India. So this is one of the crucial things that 18th century data will tell us, that India was one of the most fertile areas. 3 crops were being produced here and things like that. Anyway, we will not have more time. So finally, there is a detailed data on how this produce was distributed. So there are 2 kinds of ways in which this was distributed. Actually, at least about 30% of the produce was given to various village functionaries and also to some people outside of the village, both administrators and scholars and other things. And these were done in 2 ways. One is, about 1/4 of the cultivated land, the revenue of that land was assigned. That is, whatever was going to the state. In India, traditionally, an agricultural producer has to give 1/6 of the produce as revenue to the king. So that is called the Manyam arrangement. If a land is given as Inam, what by Inam may have meant much different things in later times, but the traditional Indian idea is that the revenue of the land is given to the Manyam holder. So in some sense, he becomes equal to the sovereign. So this sovereignty is shared widely. Second is, from the production itself, about 1/3 is assigned. So in each village, there is a huge list of persons, functionaries, most of them irrigation, the ironsmith, blacksmith, barber, washerman, doctor, school teacher, the village accountant, the policeman, the palagar, the militiaman. So like that, and the temples, temple servants, all those things are there. So I will say something more about it perhaps tomorrow morning when I talk about the local polity in detail. So this locality budget is what makes the village a self-governing institution. But it gave about 10% of this. 2/3 was for the village itself, 1/3 was for maintaining larger institutions. So in that sense, the village built up the wealth of the larger institutions. So there are temples which are receiving shares from 1,000 villages. There are temples which are receiving shares from 200 villages, things like that. So in Pune lecture, Dharampalji concluded about all this. He said the most important part of this survey concerns this total agricultural produce of the village, which was used for the maintenance of various institutions and infrastructure of the village, and the intra-village, that is larger institutions and offices. So there is this, and similar data implies that every person in the society enjoyed a certain dignity, and that his social and economic needs were well provided for. The deductions were for both internal and external. The polity which this data suggests is the kind of polity that Mahatma Gandhi tried to spell out in his idea of oceanic circles. So what is that? Just about the time of the Constituent Assembly's meeting, Mahatma Gandhi wrote an article called On Independence in his journal Harijan. So basically he is trying to say that the entire polity should be like the village is at the center. The rest of the region is not going to sit on the village. It is going to be supportive of the village, and the village will be supportive of that. It's not a pyramidical structure. It is like circles in an ocean, that the larger and larger circles are supported by the interior regions also. They support the interior regions also. So both the things are there. And he has of course said that a village should be such that it should attend to most of its needs by itself. Dharampalji's that booklet has some other very interesting data which I want to say because a lot is talked about inequalities in Indian society. So the great Thomas Munro once again did a survey in 1806 in the district of Bellary. He was a collector of both Bellary and Kadapa. So he did this survey. So he did what is called consumption. Today also it is done. There is this, what is this called? Sample survey system of India, which does this consumption survey. And much of this poverty and other estimates are based upon this sample survey data. So what Thomas Munro did was, he surveyed the population about what they were consuming. And so on the basis of what they were consuming, he classified the population into three parts. One is the reasonably well-to-do, more prosperous. So they were 2.6 lakhs. Second is households. Second is medium means, 3.7 lakhs. Finally, lowly, that is 2.2 lakhs. So that is about 30%, 44% and 26% of the total population of 8.5 lakhs. But what was crucial was, the total per capita per annum consumption was estimated at rupees 17 for those belonging to the first category, 9 for those belonging to the second category, 7.7 rupees 7 annas for those in the third category. There is a lot of details that the amount of food consumed would be the same, but the type of food consumed will be different between the different classes. Or there will be, everybody would be consuming pan, but maybe the first class would be consuming 1.5 times more pan, things like that. But the basic necessities were more or less equally consumed. And there are many other such data on what is paid to the temple servants. And the same kind of, between 4:1, even in Brihadishwara temple, it is that kind of ratio which is maintained between the top and the other ordinary temple servants, things like that. So Dharampalji wrote this book, Bhartiya Chitta Manaskar. I will not talk about that. You can read it. It's a small booklet. The basic thing he was trying to say was, it's high time that we get a good conception of what was India's civilizational framework. In every issue, in politics, in education, in society, in technology, in science, we get a good idea and then try to see how much of it we are in tune with it now, and how much of it our people are in tune with what we are following today. I mean, the ideas like a society has to function for a continuous economic progress, or ideas like every citizen has to be subservient to the state. These are modern ideas. Indian civilization has not. It has always talked about different eras having different kind of prosperity, affluence and all that. But they maintained an equanimity amidst all that. They also saw to it that people were aware of calamities that are coming and provided it. All this was done. At the other end, the individual in India always thought that he was in direct communion, or he was an amsha of the great creator. So he won't be subservient to any authority against his own free will and understanding. So this is contrary to the kind of thing that is taught and is practiced in most Western societies from its slavery situation, from its feudalism, from the time of early laissez-faire economies, then the communist system and today's market economies. The individual is at the mercy of the state, and they have sort of accepted that kind of a philosophy. India has never sort of, its ordinary citizens' dignity was always held high, and the ruling authority also always acceded to that opinion. So he wants us to sort of understand the basic framework of the Indian mind and Indian consciousness, and that will enable us to regain and reconstruct all our public systems and activities in a way in which all our people can participate with due dignity and enthusiasm and effective output. Thank you very much.